Hello, everybody. This is John with Gringo Hacker, and I wanted to inaugurate my new YouTube channel with an answer to the question that is probably the most common that I get, which is how do I become a product manager? So let's get into it. The interesting thing about product is that, in stark contrast to a discipline like software engineering, for example, there is not a common default linear path to becoming one. Case in point, if you are a software engineer, chances are you went to university for 4 years, studied computer science or an adjacent discipline, become a junior, become a senior, choose whether you want to go the engineering management route or become an architect, whatever. But the point is, there is a blueprint that most people follow. Not everybody. I do know some people who went through boot camps and actually became highly successful and excellent engineers that I did work with. So it's not universal. But in contrast, product tends to be, how do I put it, like a little bit more idiosyncratic. Meaning that when you interview, let's say, 10 product managers about how they got into the discipline, you will probably get maybe not 10 different answers, but at least five. And I'll go through in this video my experience and like my path, because that's the one thing that I can speak to authoritatively. However, I did spin up, I've done a lot of recruiting, and I did also build an associate product manager program for Carvana when I was running about half the product team there. So I have seen a lot of junior product managers and how they get into it. That program in particular was all about giving resources, mentorship, structure to what tends to be a kind of chaotic and, again, non-linear path into the discipline for anybody who either wanted to switch from one career to another or was just coming straight out of college. So all of that to say that I have seen a lot of folks in their paths. So I'm going to try and tease out a few archetypes that might be useful if you were trying to work backwards to, well, what path could I follow if indeed I wanted to go for this? So my path is, I don't know if it's interesting, but it is relatively unique, I think. I went to Caltech undergraduate and did not actually study computer science. I've been coding since I was 8. I started down the CS path, and when you know everything that is in the courses already, it ends up just not being interesting. And my goal was not to spend 4 years just coasting. I actually wanted to learn stuff. So I sampled a bunch of different things. I did a lot of very deep statistics work, applied mathematics, econometrics, economics, all of this stuff, and came out of it kind of knowing that I wanted to get into technology. That was in part due to trying finance and deciding I hated the culture, and also needing to have a technical component, or at least a quantitative component. So as my time in university ended, I started talking to tech companies and kind of just thinking I would become an engineer because I knew how to do it. And one of the interviewers at Microsoft actually suggested that I talk to a product team. Anyway, I went down that path, really liked what I heard about everything, and decided that I would pursue it. So that was actually my first job. And it's kind of funny because I've been more or less the startup guy ever since. But yeah, my first job out of college was very much the big corporate product manager. Again, program manager at Microsoft, the same thing. So that was what worked for me. And after that, I went on to work for LinkedIn pretty early before the IPO. I was doing developer tooling there. And so, again, highly technical position. After that, I founded my own startup, which ended up appealing to the founders of Wealthfront, which was one of, if not the earliest, online wealth managers. Became the first PM there, and I think they have like 25 billion under management now. So that became a pretty successful company. Um, Eventually joined Carvana and ran a large part of the product team there. And I've always been building on the side too. So I've seen both sides of engineering and product, but yeah, that was my path. So that being said, I mean, there are other paths too, and I mean, a lot of other paths. I have to say that probably my favorite path, meaning like the people that I enjoyed working with the most, I got to be honest, were the ex engineers. And so I'll call this path number one. And this is typically going to be somebody who starts at a company. It may very commonly, it's their first job. They get involved in, of course, doing daily engineering tasks, but they just cannot restrain themselves from getting involved in the business, And sooner or later, somebody, usually somebody on the product team, will be like, you know what? Like, if you're so interested in this, how come you don't just, switch to the dark side? So I've assisted with those transitions several times too. The wonderful thing about those people is that they actually understand how things work and they have a high degree of empathy for engineers, having written code themselves. They understand what it is like to get a requirements doc that is underspecified and potentially how to wrangle what a PM actually wants out of that person and everything else. And so the good thing about them is that they will go into a product role understanding what is really useful for an engineer. The downside is they are sometimes too close to the technology. And so if you want to follow this path, that would be my number one piece of advice is sometimes you will need to forget a little bit of what you have learned. Meaning that just because you know that something works in a certain way, your number one job as a product manager is actually to reason from what is useful to your customers. So with that in mind, sometimes just knowing, oh, that's going to be a pain in the ass to implement. Like maybe I should stay away from that. Sometimes a pain in the ass is actually the right thing for your users and you need to do it. So those sorts of things, be aware of those. But on balance, it's definitely a great background to come in with. So the second path that I see very commonly is business school. Somebody starts with a different profession, whatever it might be, and then they decide later that they want to get into product. And so, incidentally, I think this is probably one of only two possibly valid reasons for going to business school. I am not a proponent of business school at all. I think for most people, it's a waste of time and money. Prime earning years in your later 20s. And I should qualify that by saying it's a waste of time and money for people who are sort of on this Silicon Valley technical track, whether that's in product or engineering. I could probably do a longer video on this, but I think the two valid reasons to go to business school are basically number one, to switch careers, which I'm going to come back to, or number two, the network. And the truth of the matter is, especially if you're in Silicon Valley, your network is kind of going to grow organically and it's going to grow really fast if you actually spend time trying to nurture that. So I don't know how useful that is. The reason that could be useful, again, probably less so in the Valley, but the reason that could be useful is to switch into another career. And I have seen it done with product many times. Somebody will start in, I don't know, an accounting role, and then they will become a product manager after the fact. So it's kind of like a reset in a sense. Like you may have been on a certain track before, and then you can switch over to doing something else after you do your 2 years in purgatory. So it's a different approach, I guess. An expensive one, and you do lose a couple of years of your life to it. But there are upsides too. I mean, I know a lot of people who had good experiences. Again, I'll probably do a separate video on this at some point. Not that I'm an expert at all, but just some observations there. All right, so of the four paths, I would say that if you can find an APM program, do it. I mean, it's going to be a fairly linear path. The way that we had it set up at Carvana was you did 6 months rotating between different teams. And of course, there was guidance and mentorship and all these things along the way. And then at the end of that, we had a pretty strict up or out policy. Like there was no scenario where we would allow somebody to become a 5-year associate product manager. Like you needed to prove that you were good enough to become a PM, a full PM. And at that point, you got promoted. Typically after 6 months or a year, if it was going to happen at all. So that was how that worked, and I think it was a very successful program for scaling our headcount the way it needed to be scaled at the time. So if you can find a program like that that doesn't just give you the title, but actually will give you the guidance and support that you need to transition into a new career, do it. I mean, that's basically the upside of business school, but without, I'm not going to say wasting, but spending 2 years of your life and $250,000 just to get into a different type of work. Secondary to that, I mean, I guess business school would be a fairly linear path. I've seen a lot of people transition successfully from that school into doing product. You do have to be a little bit aware that, I don't know if stigma is the right word, but business school PMs are a thing that people know about. And I would actually argue that a lot of the business school people I've worked with have been very good. They certainly bring a level of professionalism that I think, outward professionalism anyway, that comes with having been trained in that sort of environment. I think they get hated on in the Valley a little bit because of that, where it's such an informal place that the slick guy from Wharton or whatever may not be the best culture fit for a bunch of guys who sit around and drink Mountain Dew and code in hoodies. So anyway, that is what it is. But it's not a bad option. It's just, I don't know. Like I don't think it's the greatest way to get into it, all things considered. Now, if you can transition internally at your company from engineering or recruiting, per the example that I mentioned earlier, just through accumulating tribal knowledge and building relationships and all of that stuff, that's a good option too, actually. And you're going to have the advantage of those pre-existing relationships to bring with you into the job, and that's a big thing too. I mean, product in large part is about building bridges with people. So if you already have the bridges, that's a good chunk of your work done for you. And so that can work too. The downside there is that it's just less predictable. You don't necessarily know that you're going to ever have that opportunity. And a lot of times you almost need to find a sponsor inside a product who will vouch for you and say, hey, look, this guy is good, this gal is good, come on over. But it can work. And I have personally been that shepherd, if you will, and brought people in. And I've seen it work out very, very well too. So it's not a bad option. So anyway, I hope that that was useful. If you have thoughts, feedback, want to argue with me, whatever it is, I know there's a bunch of business school people out there. Just leave it in the comments below. Please like, please subscribe. This is a new channel, so every little bit helps. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to making more videos soon.